The NFL trade deadline is quickly approaching. With the Detroit Lions having a glaring need at the edge rusher position, there are a few players and a few teams out there that have already proven that they are willing to sell off their players that could fill the Detroit Lions' needs for this season. And today, we're going to take a look at the best trade targets and the best trade options for the Detroit Lions as the trade deadline approaches. Now, before we get into the players that are realistic to this roster and realistic to be traded, there are a couple of players that are not realistically going to be traded, right? Myles Garrett is not leaving the Browns. Max Crosby is not leaving the Raiders. Hassan Reddick is not leaving the Jets. And Nick Bosa is not leaving the San Francisco 49ers. We can go a little farther down this rabbit hole, right? TJ Watt is not leaving the Steelers. Josh Hines Allen is not leaving the Jaguars. Although that one is a little more realistic, it in reality is probably never going to happen. The way that these players get off their rosters is they publicly demand a trade. They publicly state and they say, hey, I am not going to play. Trade me. Get me out of this organization and put me somewhere where I can succeed better. That is the only way stars like this leave their roster. It's the only way in the past stars like that have led their roster, and it's not going to happen, right? This offseason, this season, Garrett will finish the season as a Brown. Crosby will finish the season as a Raider. Reddick will probably finish the season as a Jet, and Bosa will almost certainly finish the season as a 49er. These guys are not on the trade market. They are not on the trade block, and asking for Brad Holmes or any general manager to go out and acquire one of these players without selling just about everything that you have of value is unrealistic for the NFL fans. Now, with that being said, there are a couple of realistic trade options for the Detroit Lions and different teams that have already proven to be below average in the NFL, right? The New England Patriots, the Cleveland Browns, the Tennessee Titans, the Jacksonville Jaguars, Carolina Panthers, New York Jets, and the New Orleans Saints are all teams that are 2-5 or worse on the season, right? The Patriots, the Browns, the Titans all have a single win, as do the Panthers. The Saints, the Giants, and the Jaguars, I believe, all have 2 victories on the season. All of these teams are likely not to make the playoffs, right? And I'm not going to say that there's nothing to be gained from this season because there's always something to be gained, right? Even if you're not making the playoffs, you can develop young talent. You can, see what kind of players you have in your depth. There are things to play for this season for all of these teams. The playoffs are just not one of those things. And with that being said, a lot of the time in these situations, NFL teams will sell off their assets and they will sell off their better players to acquire draft picks to begin their uphill climb of a rebuild. Now, with that being said, the NFL trade deadline is well over a week away. Of course, the Detroit Lions and the rest of the NFL still have to play a game before the November 5th deadline. And I think this could be a massive week for a lot of teams, right? The Raiders are 2-5. If they drop to 2-6, they may be more willing to sell off their assets. And while it won't be Max Crosby, you could potentially get a couple of assets from there if you find them appealing. The New York Giants have a couple of players that I think the Lions could be interested in. And again, they are 2-5. If they fall to 2-6, they may be more likely to sell. But if they jump to 3-5, if they win that next game, well, now you're just 2 games behind 500. You're starting to figure it out after a rough start to the season. You might be less willing to sell. The Miami Dolphins are 2-5, right? They've been without Tua Tagovailoa for the last couple of weeks, well over a month at this point. They are 2-5. If they lose this weekend and they fall to 2-6, there's a chance that they might be willing to sell some assets, right? It won't be Tyreek Hill, it won't be Jalen Waddle, but if you look on the defensive side of the ball there, they might be willing to sell off a pass rusher. The Saints, same situation, 2-5. They go 3-5 with a rookie quarterback. They say, hey, we've started to figure it out. Spencer Rattler's starting to play better. Derek Carr might come back at some point. We might have something here to play for. But if you fall to 2-6, well, now you're 4 games behind 500 halfway through the season. You probably aren't going to make anything of the season. And same thing goes for Jackson, right? They're 2-5, 2-6 versus 3-5 is a massive difference. And for these teams like the Rams, right? They were 2-4 last night. They beat the Vikings. Now they're 3-4. Now they're just 1 game back from first place in the division, and they have a chance to compete for the playoffs now that they're healthy, right? There are different scenarios, and this is why I think a lot of people want to push the trade deadline back, is because if you're 3-4 or you're 3-5, you don't really know how good you are, right? You know you're not elite, you know you're not fantastic, but you might sneak into the playoffs. You might be good enough to go 9-8. You might be good enough to go 8-9, right? And sneak into that wild card. And for teams, that's enough sometimes. For some teams, that's enough to not sell. That's enough to, say, hey, we're going to try to push for the playoffs. We're going to try to build on this season, and we're going to try to set a benchmark that we can look to, overachieve on next season. But a lot of teams that fall to 2-6 don't have that mindset, and they end up selling off a lot of their assets. So taking a look at some of the realistic trade options, right? I've separated it into two tiers, that being tier 1 of edge rusher 1s and tier 2 of edge rusher 2s. In my tier 1, I see just two potential trade targets, two guys that I think can be number 1 edge rushers on a season, can hit that 10-11 sack mark, but also are realistic to be traded, right? Those guys being, of course, Harold Landry from the Tennessee Titans and Travon Walker from the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then you have tier 2, players that probably aren't going to be your elite edge rusher 1, probably will never hit above 8 sacks in their season, but can still be good contributors, can still be good pieces on a defensive line, and can still tide you over until next season when Aiden Hutchinson inevitably comes back. Those guys, I think, on the trade block are Zadarius Smith from the Cleveland Browns, Azeez Ojulari from the New York Giants, and Carl Granderson from the New Orleans Saints. I would also potentially put Cam Jordan from the Saints on this list. However, he's yet to record a sack this season. Even though he's played quite a few snaps for the Saints, it does seem like he's kind of fallen off last season, did not have a good year either. So I would much rather Carl Granderson, a younger player who's producing higher numbers, than an older veteran such as Cam Jordan. But these are my 5 guys. These are the 5 guys that I think are not only realistic to be traded for, but also guys that would fit with the Detroit Lions, guys that would not sacrifice too much draft capital, guys that would not sacrifice too much capital from the cap space, and guys that would fit with the Detroit Lions need right now and add some juice to this roster. Now, with that being said, I think the best option is Harold Landry from the Tennessee Titans. With a Week 8 loss to the Detroit Lions this week, if they do lose, the Titans will fall to 1-6. They have already proven that they are willing to trade away their assets. They've traded DeAndre Hopkins to the Chiefs for a conditional 5th-round pick, and they've traded starting linebacker Ernest Jones, who has nearly 50 tackles through the first 6 games of the season, to the Seattle Seahawks for, I believe, a 4th-round pick in Jerome Baker. They are selling off these pieces for depth players and day 3 selections, and I don't think that Harold Landry is safe either. Harold Landry would likely cost more than Hopkins and Ernest Jones, right? He is the best defensive player they have outside of Jeffrey Simmons. And I do think that while being on the trade block and being an option, he would be more expensive. He'd likely be more of a day 2 pick, which I think is more than fair for the value you're getting for Harold Landry. Now, why Harold Landry? Why is he the best option and he the best pick? Well, he has a history with Detroit Lions defensive line coach Terrell Williams. In 2023, under Terrell Williams, Landry walked away with 10.5 sacks and 14 tackles for loss, while in 2021, he had 12 sacks and 14 tackles for loss. Every year he's played under Terrell Williams, he's put up double-digit sack numbers, and the Detroit Lions quite simply have the picks to do it, right? They have their 1st-round and 2nd-round selections from this year. They have a 4th, 5th, 6th, and 2 7th-round picks to get it done. And if they do trade for Harold Landry, the Tennessee Titans for the first 2 seasons would take on a majority of the dead cap space, so the Detroit Lions realistically wouldn't have to pay very much. In 2024, they'd only be paying Harold Landry $4.1 million after the dead cap that Tennessee pays him. In 2025, they'd only be paying just under $11 million. And then in 2026, it does jump. It does go to $17.5 million. But one season over $11 million for a pass rusher that can realistically get you 10, 11 sacks on a season to pair with Aiden Hutchinson in 2025 and 2026 seems like a good enough value and a good enough deal, because 2026 is likely the season Aiden Hutchinson's contract takes over for his extension. It's going to be the year that Jared Goff's extension takes over, the year that St. Brown's extension starts taking over, and Sewell starts to get expensive. So you can leave Harold Landry behind after 2026 and, use that $20 million to pay Aiden Hutchinson, to pay Kirby Joseph, to pay Brian Branch, to pay some of these other guys that have earned their 2nd contract while getting significant value out of that pick that you gave up for Harold Landry. Now, my exact trade proposal looks a little something like this, right? I think the Detroit Lions want Harold Landry, right? That is not really a question. If Terrell Williams is going to vouch for this guy, he's a guy that Brad Holmes is potentially looking at. I think the Detroit Lions would give up a second round pick in James Houston. James Houston is a player that a lot of people really like in Detroit, but quite frankly hasn't lived up to his 2022 self. He finished 2022 with 8 sacks in 7 games. His bend was phenomenal. His pass rushing prowess was up there with some of the best rookies in the NFL. He looked like a dangerous, dynamic pass rusher for the Detroit Lions for years to come. But after getting hurt in the 2023 season in week 2, he put on a lot of weight. In the offseason, he put on weight. He put on about 15, 20 pounds from where he was as a rookie. The Lions wanted him to play Sam linebacker. Didn't really work out in the preseason, so they put him back at edge. But now being back at edge, he's about 15 pounds heavier. The bend isn't quite there. The rush isn't quite there. The explosiveness isn't quite there. And while I love James Houston, and I would love to see James Houston succeed, I think putting on those 15, 20 pounds was probably the worst thing he could have done in his career. I think he still has some potential. He still has about 2 years left on his contract from, if I am correct, maybe a year and a half at this point. But there is still some potential. And I think that the Titans might be willing to take on this project, right? See what they can do with him this offseason, see if they can put him on the field in 2025. But I think that's going to cost them an extra 4th round pick. So the overall compensation, the Detroit Lions give up their 2nd round pick and they give up James Houston. In return, they get Harold Landry in a 4th round pick. They still hold 7 picks in the draft, only 1 pick in the first 3 rounds, but they hold several picks on day 3, which could still give them some depth within the roster. That is my trade proposal. I think that Harold Landry is the most likely player to get traded, and I think he is the best option for the Detroit Lions as they look for a pass rusher. He fills what they need. He provides edge rusher 1 type of quality. He would pair pretty well with Josh Paschal on the other side, a finesse and a power rusher. Pair that with the 2 defensive tackles in the center that collapse the pocket. Harold Landry can be the cleanup guy, and I think he could still put up about 10 to 11 sacks this season with the Detroit Lions. This makes the most sense to me. This is the team that is shown that they are willing to trade. The player that is at the top of his game right now, still in his prime, has a connection to the Detroit Lions coaching staff as of right now. And I think that this is the best option for Detroit. But of course, let me know down in the comments below. Who do you think is the best option? Do you think it's Harold Landry? Do you think it's Carl Granderson? Or are you still holding out hope that it might be a Trey Hendrickson, that it might be a Max Crosby, that it might be an elite guy like a top 10 player at their position? I'd be curious to hear your guys' opinions, or either the other way, right? Do you think Brad Holmes just sits on his hands and says, hey, we've got it covered. We've got enough depth. We have Uku, we have Houston, we have Paschal, we have some of these guys. Nowaske is playing really well, and sits on his hands and doesn't do anything? Or do you think he makes a trade for the betterment of the team? I'd be curious to hear what you guys think. But with that being said, all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so very much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.